As defined by George Ritzer, global social change is social change involving variations over time in every aspect of the social world, ranging from changes affecting individuals to transformations having global impacts. In the modern era, this has taken the form of anything from nonviolent protest to civil war. There are many examples of global social change movements that have been shaping our planet since the foundations of society. The Tea Party, the feminist movement, LGBTQ movements, and the Arab Spring are just some examples of movements that have had major impacts on our world. In general, social change movements seek to positively change society through means of protest. However, they do not always achieve the goals they set out for. There are several different outcomes possible for social change movements. A lateral shift in government is when the regime being protested against is replaced by one that ends up being much the same, like moving from one authoritarian government to another. A progressive shift is one where the style of government changes towards a more democratic makeup. Social change movements that end in a progressive shift are often considered successful, but the level of success varies greatly.
In our presentation, we will be focusing on the Arab Spring, a series of armed rebellions and protests that began in 2010 as a response to the low standards of living and repressive regimes throughout the Middle East. While there were some mild successes, the Arab Spring is considered by many to be a failure and a lateral shift in government. However, the Arab Spring still exemplifies many important aspects of a social change movement. The current Middle East was under colonial rule for many years, and the signs of colonization still remain today, as many countries have jumped from one anti-democratic regime to another. Examples of this include Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. For example, the United Kingdom declared Egypt's independence in 1922, but remained a strong political force in the country. Fed up with their pseudo-independence, a group of Egyptian officers named the Free Officers Movement, led by Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, overthrew the monarchy and took control of the government, making Egypt into a police state. This portrays the cyclic nature of oppressive regimes. Even when the people feel like they are gaining a breath of freedom, they often find themselves thrust under yet another authoritative dictator.
The Arab Spring all started in 2010 with Mohamed Bouazizi, a Tunisian street vendor who, as an act of defiance, lit himself on fire in the street as a demonstration against the current governmental regime. This inspired protests against authoritarian regimes across the Middle East with the common goal of achieving a more democratic government. The Arab Spring consisted of uprisings in Egypt, Yemen, and Syria in 2011, along with the Jasmine Revolution and the Libyan Revolt. Governments responded with brutal crackdowns on protests that involved the use of military power, and several human rights violations were reported. Videos of the event spread all over social media, acting as a catalyst for protests all around the region. In Tunisia, 1 month after Bouazizi lit himself on fire, the autocratic president for over 20 years in Tunisia, Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali, fled to Saudi Arabia. He was then replaced by a democracy that experienced terror attacks and many economic troubles. ISIS attacks on the nation decreased any tourist attraction there was for Tunisia, the weak economy causing the country to continue to control the rampant extremism.
In Egypt, protesters were attempting to take down the Mubarak regime. The Egyptian military were praised and credited with the downfall of the Mubarak regime. However, the military were hesitant to relinquish power completely to the newly elected government. Protests continued to spread across the region, with movements taking root in Yemen, Libya, Syria, Tunisia, that turned into a long and deadly struggle. The Libyan protests revolted against the regime of al-Gaddafi in 2011. In March, after the protesters were on the verge of defeat, NATO launched an airstrike campaign targeting the presidential forces. This tipped the power in favor of the rebels, and the president, Muammar Gaddafi, was only able to hold power for a little longer before he was eventually killed when the rebel forces took control of the city. Gaddafi was hunted down to a roadside drain, killed, dragged, and later his body was put on display. The Libyan government wasn't out of the woods yet, as they still had to set up a new transitional national council that struggled to establish government institutions restart the economy, and exert control over the tribal militias that participated in the rebellion. In addition, the Libyan rebels then began to turn on each other, splitting the country. The rates of criminality and human trafficking soared.
Social media plays a big part in the interconnectedness of countries around the world. Social media allowed Arab Spring movements to grow faster and provided ways for people to organize protests, and was also a way for those people to exercise free speech. To combat this, governments in unstable countries use social media to their advantage to prevent their own citizens from seeing these protests and getting ideas. This was seen specifically in Egypt, where they have tight restrictions on media. At times, the Arab Spring was referred to as the Twitter and Facebook revolutions. Facebook allowed activists to organize protests, and Twitter allowed people to be kept updated on the protests. Many parts of the Arab Spring were documented on cell phones, from videoing of the protests to show aspects like the tear gas, beatings, and shootings that were also taking place.
The Arab Spring was generally considered a failure, as there was little immediate change to the original oppressive regimes. Along with this, little was done to improve living conditions for the people of those countries. However, the Arab Spring represented a new age of protesting oppressive governments, serving as a starting point for a more democratic society. The impacts of the Arab Spring were felt through the rest of the world as well. Social media acted as a conveyor for all these protests, as sharing of the footage from events from the news coverage. The ideas that originated in Tunisia not only proliferated through the rest of the Middle East and inspired even more protests, but resonated with nations across the globe.
We can learn many things from the Arab Spring that are applicable to social change across the globe. Firstly, things don't always work on the first try. Sometimes it takes repeated attempts to get something right, especially when it comes to something as complicated as overthrowing a system of government and successfully implementing another. Secondly, we can see firsthand how hard it can be to try and recover from a failed social change movement. There's a reason why these things don't happen every 2 or 3 years. It's because they inherently cause a lot of instability, which in turn takes time to repair. This is why we are only now, 10 years later, hearing whispers about a second Arab Spring in the Middle East, as many people are not happy with the results of the first one. Finally, we can see the reason why social change movements have been such a big part of history. When people decide they want change and they want it badly, their resilience is unlike anything else. Even after the Tiananmen Square massacre, the people of Hong Kong are boldly standing up to mainland China's government. Even after generations of abuse and desecration, slaves kept standing up for themselves, and today African Americans and minorities across the globe are still fighting for true equality. All this goes to say that it would be foolish to count the people of the Arab Spring as disheartened or put down. History says that they will likely continue fighting for themselves until they get what they want, even if it takes the ultimate sacrifice. As seen, global social change affects not only society at large, but changes the lives of individuals everywhere.